helping me with our lesson today. We're here in our home, in our front room. It's our Disney/drum room. We are going to be using some Easter eggs today to talk about our lesson. Kaylee has those. They are resurrection eggs. You might have seen these before. Every egg in the pack has something to do with Holy Week, and that's where we're in the middle of right now. Let's see what's our first egg, Kaylee.
First we have a blue egg, and inside we have a tiny silver donkey.
All right, we have a donkey. And why do we have a donkey, Kaylee?
Because Jesus rode in on a donkey on Palm Sunday.
He did,
Yeah.
yes. Jesus rode on a donkey when he was entering Jerusalem, and that's what we celebrate as Palm Sunday. We did that last week. We talked about people waving palms. Y'all made a video about it, and they were welcoming the King and preparing for Jesus that way. What do we have next, Kaylee?
Next we have a pink egg, and inside we have some coins, some
All right, we
Roman
have
coins.
some coins. Now these represent the money that Judas got for betraying Jesus.
Yes.
Judas was one of Jesus's 12 disciples, and there were some religious leaders called the Pharisees, and the Pharisees didn't like Jesus because Jesus preached things that the Pharisees weren't quite in line with, and so they didn't want it. They were kind of wrong, honestly, and they didn't want to hear it. So they wanted Jesus out of a position of influence. Judas also kind of got a little disillusioned with Jesus. He wasn't sure that Jesus was lining up to be the king that he thought he was going to be, or the kind of leader. And so Judas arranged to give information to the Pharisees. And so he betrayed Jesus by leading them to Jesus. We'll get to that in just a minute, but let's see what's in our next egg.
We have a light purple egg, and I think I just broke it.
That's
but
all
fine.
right.
We have a cup.
Okay. Oh, let's see. All right, we have a little cup. And if that looks like a communion cup, you're right. That's exactly what it is. Jesus and his disciples, tomorrow night, we will have a service called the Maundy Thursday service. And that is where Jesus was having dinner with his disciples. It was for a Passover feast. You know what Passover is?
Yes.
That's back when Moses was trying to rescue the slaves from Egypt, and there was a plague coming. There were several plagues. There was one, it was like the spirit of death was passing through, and the people that painted their doors with lamb's blood, the spirit would pass over those houses. And so they would celebrate that with dinner, and that's what Jesus was doing with his disciples. And at that dinner is when Jesus said, take this bread and break it. This is my body given for you. And then the cup, this is my blood given for you. So that's what our communion today came from that Last Supper, which was the Passover meal.
Next. Oh,
Oh, no.
sorry.
Yeah, next.
Next egg is orange, and it has some praying hands.
Praying hands. So after that dinner, Jesus went to, do you know where Jesus went to pray?
Went to the garden.
The Garden of Gethsemane. Yes. He went there to pray that God's will be done. He took some of the disciples with him, and even though he knew what God wanted him to do, he was still praying, like, make sure this is right, this is what you want. And he took friends with him. And that's to let us know, like, we don't ever have to be alone in anything. We can bring people with us. And that God is always with us when we're going through hard times and difficult things. Just like Jesus prayed to God, that we can do that same thing. Now, after that, Jesus prayed in the garden, that's when Judas brought some soldiers and some people to him, and they came to arrest Jesus. After Jesus was arrested, they put him on trial, and they decided to crucify him, which meant they had decided to kill him. And so they put him in a jail type thing before they were going to kill him. And in the meantime, before that, they did something that has to do with what's in this egg.
So this next egg, there's a little whip.
So yes, like a piece of leather, a little leather strap, if you can see that. Because what do they do with that? Do you know?
They whipped Jesus with it.
They did. They whipped Jesus. They were very cruel. They were mean, and they wanted to make Jesus suffer. So so they whipped him. It's very sad. Last week I said there were some dark and scary parts of Holy Week. Well, that's where we're living right now, with the dark and scary parts. So what's in the next egg, Kaylee?
This is our light yellow egg. And it has a crown of thorns.
Yes, exactly. The soldiers that had Jesus were real mean, and they mocked him, made fun of him, and said, like, oh, if you're a king, well, you need a crown. And so they made a crown of thorns. The thorns were then cut into his forehead and hurt him. And so even in the things that, in the ways that he was claiming to be a king, the things that he was claiming they were using to make fun of him. All right, what's in our next
We
one?
have our bright yellow egg. And in this one, we have nails in the shape of a cross.
Yes. So Jesus was crucified on a cross, and they actually nailed his hands and his feet. You might have seen pictures or talked about that before, but he had to carry his cross to a hill, and the crucifixion on a cross was not unique to Jesus. That's the way that they killed a lot of people. In fact, he had somebody on each side of him on that hill, but they actually would hammer and nail in his hands, in his feet, and I can't even, can you imagine what that would be like? How bad that would be with a crowd of people watching this happen, and how tired he must have been at that point.
Next we have our light green egg, and inside we have a little red dice or die.
I think it's a die.
It's a die,
I'm not really
sorry.
sure. We're gonna go with die.
We're gonna go with
We could
die.
be wrong. Yes. So the reason that we have that—that's kind of an odd thing to have, right, in your Holy Week eggs. But the reason that we have that is because the soldiers would actually they roll dice to decide who was going to get Jesus's clothing. Like while Jesus is hanging on the cross, they're dividing up his belongings, and they did that by rolling the dice. All right, what's next?
We have our regular purple egg. If I can open it. La, la. Inside of it, we have a little tiny spear. It's really hard to see.
That little spear. Yes. So the reason we have a spear is because they needed to make sure when people were on the crosses, they couldn't just leave them there. They had to make sure that they were dead. And so they came by, and if they weren't dead, a little unfortunate tidbit, if they weren't dead, sometimes they would try to hurry up the process, and they would break their knees in order to speed up the process. But because it said, it was prophesied, another thing that was prophesied is that Jesus would not have a bone broken in his body. Jesus is actually dead by the time they came to him. So they stabbed him in the side, like right here in the side, with the spear, just to make sure that he was. So what's our next thing?
We have a cream egg. That's a nice color. I like a good cream. This is a cloth.
Yes.
Gauze.
It's gauze. It's supposed to represent like the linen, if you can see that, like the linen that Jesus would have been wrapped in. So after he was crucified, they would have taken his body down from the cross, and a guy named Joseph of Arimathea, he was not one of the disciples, but he had come to believe Jesus was who he said he was. And he wanted to preserve his body, to give him a burial, and so he asked that he could have his body, and he took it to a tomb that he owned. And so what they would do is they would wrap the bodies like in this linen, and they would perfume it and try not to try to lessen the smell, because after something dies,
Stank.
it does. It does. You're not wrong. So they would wrap him in linen, and then it turns out he didn't really need the linen, and we will discuss why. Because our next egg is
it's a pink egg, and it's a little stone. Well, it's a rock, but it's supposed to be.
Yes, it's a stone. Yeah, just like you'd find outside.
Yep.
The stone that we're talking about, though, was a lot bigger than that. After they put Jesus in the tomb, they didn't want anything to happen to his body. Like his death and his life and everything was so charged emotionally for people. They didn't want anything to happen to his body, because people actually, believe it or not, would steal dead bodies, or they would steal their possessions that people were buried with. So they wanted to protect that, and so they rolled this giant stone in front of the tomb. They even sealed it to where that they knew it was closed up tight, and then they put soldiers outside of that tomb so that it would be guarded all the time and that the valuables and everything would be protected. But we know how the story ends, because what's in the last egg?
The last egg is a light blue egg, and guess what? It's empty.
Yes, very dramatic. It's empty, just like the tomb, because this all happened on a Friday. Saturday was really dark and grim. The disciples didn't know what to do next. They were all hiding in their homes. They were scared. They were confused. And then Sunday morning comes, and Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, and they saw an angel. The tomb was empty. The stone was rolled away, and there was an angel, and he said, like, he's not here. Why are you looking for him here? He's risen. And no one else in the history of ever has done what Jesus did, rose from the dead to live forever. And that's exactly what we celebrate for Easter. So we're so excited about all of the stuff that Jesus did, even though a lot of it was sad and scary and dark and painful, that he did all of that just to save us, even all of this time later, to save us and give us life forever with him in heaven. We know we're going to see Jesus one day. That's something to be excited about. But for this Sunday, we're going to celebrate Easter. We're going to, even though we're not together, we're going to have some great services online that we can watch and celebrate as a family. And if you guys want to make your own resurrection eggs, I will post all of the things. You can just draw pictures and put them in some empty Easter eggs. You can hide around your house. You can hide in the yard. And then you can tell the story of Holy Week within your family too. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Happy Easter.